All right, hello, good evening, and welcome to Tales from the Dragon's Library. I am your host, Xamot, also known as Trevor on social media, and the author of The Last Exodus, and a couple other shorts that are available on Amazon, and hopefully some more coming soon. And I would love to share the future books. My wife is. It's been sorry for the delay. It's been a hell of a week, and today has been absolutely awful. So bear with me as I get my feet back under me. Work was not pleasant today. My work is usually pretty pleasant. So anyway, what this is, if you're new to the show, is this is an interactive let me move this over so I can see both. This is an interactive audiobook podcast of sorts. I got this idea from another author, so I can't take credit for it. But another author I'd heard said he got a lot of feedback reading his novel. I believe he wrote and edited at the same time. I am just editing. I may be adding scenes and things like that. But for the most part, this is a complete and finished novel. It just needs its final edits done because I may wind up having to self-publish, and that means self-editing, unless I want to pay somebody to rip me off to edit my book, which I don't really want to do. So we're going to jump right in. This is our third episode. We are actually into chapter 15 now. If you are new to the show, just so you know what's going on here, this is, and I'm not going to hide it, this is a political story. It is a dystopian political thriller set in the near-ish future, not too distant future. I'm not real specific on time frame. And you're also going to find that when I say political, I mean all politics. This book is not meant to target any particular ideology. This is meant to expose how similar the two halves. I guess you could say, if you believe in horseshoe theory, this book highlights how similar both ends of said horseshoe are. If you don't know what that is, do please look it up. I don't want to do a whole podcast on what horseshoe theory is, but check it out, look it up. But we're into chapter 15 of The Last Exodus. This story revolves around a group of people whose lives have been altered for a while. I believe about 20 years. Life has not been what it used to be in North America, the United States. And this group of people, not hesitantly, but they are led by a man named John Everman, who does not want to be the leader, but they look to him as the person to help them get to a better life. Where they live is not so great. They have very little freedom. Everything is controlled by the state. Everything they're taken care of, but they live just like everybody else in a near state of almost abject poverty. And they all want to go to a better life. And part of America split off when things went south, so to speak. And they are trying to get to the part of America that is like what it used to be, where people do have freedoms and people have rights, and things aren't quite so crazy. So this is interactive. I may or may not take any suggestions, but if something does stand out as odd, if something doesn't make sense, or you notice a typo or something that I miss as I'm reading, drop it in the chats. If you are watching the recording and you notice anything, drop it in the comments or send me a message on Twitter. The contact information is in the YouTube description of the video, so you'll be able to drop me a line on Twitter or on Facebook and say, hey, I noticed this section makes zero sense. You can look back through my Twitter feed for a link to this book where you can read it ahead of time online if you want, or in your own time, bearing in mind that it is an unedited version, so it may be different than what you will see in past episodes of the show or what you'll see going forward, because I did edits and I did not transfer them to the online version of this book. It was submitted online for a contest and it's still available to read. So I will share the link to that after the show, but you can find it if you want. You can find it on some of my past tweets from last week and the week before. Look around the same night, Thursday night, and you'll find it. So we're going to jump right in with chapter 15, which is where we left off last time. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this here because I don't need it highlighted anymore. That was just to mark where we were at. Each chapter, the way I wrote this, each chapter gives us an insight into the history of what happened through John's eyes, through John's perspective, his political spectrum and his personal perspective. And I wanted to do this in lieu of giving you a huge prologue or giving you some sort of backstory at the very beginning that tells you what led up to this. So I wanted to use these sort of journal excerpts to give you guys a history of the world that John lives in. So here we go. Chapter 15's journal entry. Public criticism and dissent escalated in the summer after the president seized total power. Opponents of the president and his party called for resumption of elections and criminal charges against the president. Opponents. I think we have to capitalize president in this context, and we're going to change against the new dictator, because he did take total power in this particular point in history. A large number of the most influential critics in the media were arrested first, as an example. It was enough to silence most. It also made it easier for the government to round up the ones who didn't get the hint. I wrote this very formally when I first started writing. I did start this book a few years back, and I've since gained a little more experience and a little more knowledge, and I don't write quite as formally as I used to. There was one holdout. He was a media personality that caused waves through the entire political spectrum. When the first arrests were made, he had been a target, but he had been lucky to have... okay, so this sentence really sucks. When the first arrests were made, he'd been a target. Let's try that. Let's try editing this. He'd been a target, but he was lucky enough to have warning. Oh, stupid word. Was lucky enough to have warning. And escape and go underground. They never did find him. He broadcast his views for a long time in secret, moving from place to place in case they pinned down the source of the transmission. Underground, it does. Oh, because I didn't spell underground right. He broadcast his views for a long time in secret, moving from place to place in case they pinned down the source of the transmission. He tried to rally people to speak out, but most who had the heart already left during the migration. Finally, having to admit the country was truly lost, he moved to Texas as well. I hear he lives with his family near Dallas now. Broadcasters in the Republic of Texas tried to get him on the air again, but he just didn't have the heart anymore. A staunch patriot and his heart broken. Let's see here. He was a staunch patriot and had his heart broken by the very people he hoped to save. That's the official story anyway. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. So that a good example when you're editing and something you want to do, even while you're writing, is a good idea to do, but read it out loud. I know that people say that, and even I did this. When I used to hear that, I would roll my eyes and go, but I can hear myself talking in my head when I read these things. Not true. You hear what you want to hear when you are reading this in your head, because you wrote it with the words in your head, and then when you're reading it back to yourself, you're hearing the same thing that you typed, but you're not hearing how it sounds vocally, and that's entirely different. Believe me. Again, I rolled my eyes every time somebody said, "Oh, read your words aloud. It'll make a difference." And I was like, "Oh, I don't need to do that." When I started doing that, I started really, truly realizing the difference between the voice in your head and the voice out loud. They are different. A book's prose will sound entirely different read aloud than it will read silently. So do this. Do this whether you do it just to yourself or read it to somebody else, because you will find that when you read to somebody else, you are a little more cognizant of what it might sound like to them. While I'm reading this to you and while I'm recording this, I am looking at these sentences a little differently, going, well, I think it sounds okay, but does it really sound all right? Somebody else may not be hearing it the same way I intended it to be heard. So definitely read your stuff out loud and read it out loud to somebody else, and that will help you during your editing process. John ran as hard as he could for the east end of the bridge. So I guess I should tell you, we ended that last chapter with they were crossing the bridge in Quincy from Illinois into Missouri, and at the top of the bridge is a guard shack, and unfortunately the guard that was in that shack, who was sleeping when these groups of people were crossing, he woke up and Benny had to kill him. Benny is the man that helped these people get out. He helped them get supplies, and he helped them get weapons, and he helped them get out. He's helping them move west toward Texas. I'm sorry, texting my wife because she's concerned about my stress level because I told her today sucked. So she's checking on me. But anyway, so the last chapter ended sort of at a little bit of a cliffhanger, with John racing back across the bridge because there are authorities coming, and his family is the last to cross. So his family is still on the Quincy side, the Illinois side of the bridge, and the authorities are coming. So John is racing back to the Illinois side, the east side of the bridge, and he told Benny to take everybody west and hide them off the highway in Missouri while he goes back for his family, hoping to keep them from getting captured by the feds. So that's why John is running. So John ran as hard as he could for the east side of the bridge. He could see the lights of the squad cars getting closer, and he was sure he wouldn't make it to the end of the ramp before they did. Wouldn't. He looked over the side as he ran, but it was still too high to jump. He looked ahead and saw that two buildings were very close to the left side of the bridge. It would be an easy jump, but he had to get there first. So I want to change. I don't want to use jump twice in the same. So let's see. It would be an easy leap, but he had to get there first. He pushed himself even harder, knowing that if he did make it to the roof, it would be very close. Okay, so... okay, that sounds better. The sirens were louder, closer, and John could see the red pulsating light reflecting off buildings a few blocks into the city. They were coming from both directions, but the one coming up from the south end of town would turn onto the bridge road first. John looked over the side again as he ran. The second building looked like the better bet. There were no other buildings close that would allow him to reach the ground without risking injury. I'm going to make that 2 sentences because that sounds better that way. He may not have a choice, but the second roof was his goal. John had a few more yards to go. The first squad car turned onto the main road leading to the bridge, but its lights were still at street level and not angled to illuminate the ramp. Time seemed to slow as John ran for his life and the lives of his wife and kids. The car was speeding toward the bridge, speeding toward him as he raced toward it. The squad car, okay, so yeah, I think that sounds better. The car was speeding toward him, not the him, toward him. Also why it's good to read your stuff out loud and read it after you edit it. The car was speeding toward him as he raced toward it. The squad car started up the ramp as John jumped from the concrete wall at the side of the bridge. He hit the steel roof of the building hard and fell on his side. The corrugated ridges of the roof bit hard, so we don't bit into his ribs and hip, but he lay still, holding his breath. He couldn't be sure if the car's lights had revealed him before he jumped. His ears strained. Sure, his ears strained for any sound. He was sure he was going to hear the car stop and the officer inside come after him. After what seemed like an eternity, he heard the sirens pass him by. He sighed in relief and quickly made his way to the ground. Okay, so he's jumped off the bridge, he's on the building, and he's climbing back down to the ground. So he's off the bridge, and the squad car didn't see him, thank goodness. So once he was on the ground, John looked around. He was in the middle of an old lumber and hardware supply yard. He could see the building where Steve should have been standing, directing people up the ramp to cross the bridge. No one was there. He walked around the building and headed back toward the pier, staying in the shadow of the bridge. By the time he reached the old pier, he could see the lights of the squad cars in the middle of the bridge, stopping in the middle of the bridge's arc. I want to use a different phrase there because we keep talking about the bridge. Stopped near where the guardhouse would be. Okay, let me read that again, because by the time he reached the old pier, he could see the lights of the squad cars in the middle of the bridge's arc, stopped near where the guardhouse would be. With the Bay Bridge blocked and the dead guard, it wouldn't be safe to try crossing the Bay Bridge. Hold on, something's not right there. With the Bay Bridge blocked and the dead guard, it wouldn't be safe to try crossing either bridge. So that sentence doesn't make sense. I'm not sure what did I do here. By the time he reached the old pier, he could see the lights of the squad cars in the middle of the bridge's arch. Stopped near where the guardhouse would be. I think we're going to just change that. There would be no crossing there for the near future. Yeah, let's go with that. Let's try this here. By the time he reached the old pier, he could see the lights of the squad cars in the middle of the bridge's arch, stopped near where the guardhouse would be. There would be no crossing there in the near future. The Braille Bridge was out, so their options were very limited. He pushed those thoughts back. It didn't do any good to worry about things that he wasn't able to change. He would find a way across the river, but first he had to find his family and friends. John searched the pier and the surrounding buildings, but he didn't find Todd or his family. He didn't find... That's right, I changed this. Didn't find Steve or his family. Steve was the one back there. He guessed they were probably all together. He just hoped they were all safe. He turned and headed back toward the bridge ramp. He figured they had to be hiding somewhere close, waiting for the bridge to clear. Headed back toward... We're going to say road here. Whoops, not toad. Road to clear. Okay, so waiting for the road to clear. John looked behind the old store Steve had been posted at. The alley behind the store was empty. The store was part of a haphazard group of buildings on that block. There were several dark alleyways and concealed hiding spots, and John searched them all to no avail. He started walking away from the bridge, hoping that they just went looking for a better place to hide. He crossed the next street and looked down a narrow block. And looked around the narrow block. There was little cover to be moved. There was little cover, so he moved on, crossing the next street to the north. He found himself in an empty lot between three run-down old warehouses. Amanda, Steve, John called as loudly as he dared. He was confident that he was far enough away from the authorities that he wouldn't be overheard. There was no answer, so he continued the search. His path led him to the backyard of 4 houses facing the eastern side of the block. There was nowhere to hide that he could see. While he was deciding whether to continue his search north or cross to another block and walk back toward the bridge, the back porch light of the last house flickered to life. A screen door creaked open, and an old man peered out at John. "You look lost, son," the old man said. "Looking for someone," John replied. Part of John screamed that he should run before the feds arrived, but something about the old man made him hesitate. He was reminded of his grandfather for a moment, and part of him wanted to trust the stranger. "Is your name John?" the old man asked. John's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know my name?" John asked. The old man looked around, making sure John was alone. "Someone is looking for you," the old man said. He opened the screen door further, clearly inviting John inside. John cautiously entered the kitchen at the back of the house, which erupted into chaos around him. We don't need a comma there. Shouting children greeted their father, and Amanda and Steve tried to shush. Yeah, that's a weirdly... Okay, so shouting children greeted... Oh, I see what I was doing here. So shouting children greeting their father, which describing the noises, and Amanda and Steve trying to shush the kids filled the small room with noise. John was surprised and overwhelmed with relief as he hugged Susan and Thomas. Amanda replaced the kids in his arms, and Steve and Todd shook his hand. "We heard the gunshot just before we started up the bridge. We weren't sure what happened, so we found a place to hide," Steve explained. "When we heard the sirens, we thought it best to get away from the bridge. That's when Mr. Marlowe found us." John turned to the old man and held out his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Marlowe." "Jacob," said the man, taking John's hand in his firm grip. John nodded. "Thanks, Jacob." The old man waved them toward a table and went to get a cup of coffee from the steaming pot on the kitchen counter. The kitchen was a small eat-in type that was fairly common in older homes. Cracked linoleum floors, faded wooden cabinets, and a green laminate countertop with a metal edge reminded John of his grandparents' house when they used to... their grandparents' house that they used to visit. Reminded John of his grandparents' house they used to visit. Jacob pressed the cup into John's hands. Yeah, I think this is supposed to be one word. Yeah. "Did everyone else make it through?" Steve asked after they were all sitting at the kitchen table. "Everyone," John said, smiling at Steve's sigh of relief. "I sent them ahead with Benny." The guard woke up and hit the alarm. Benny stopped him before he drew his weapon. "It won't go unnoticed by the feds for long, though. Once the locals call it in, they'll send a team to investigate. We're gonna knock this off here." So if you remember previously, the feds don't know exactly where John and his friends went. Benny left the van they stole, headed north, away from Illinois, trying to, I guess, make it look like they maybe went to Canada. And so the feds aren't quite sure. One of the officers in charge does not, he's pretty certain that it's a trick, that it's a ruse, but they're not certain. So this here is going to be... this is sort of the tense failure of the group that's going to pull the authorities back into the chase, so to speak. They've only got a short reprieve after escaping Illinois, so it won't take them long to get here. If the feds are looking for you, it's best we get you on your way, Jacob said. "We have no way across the river," John started. "I do," Jacob interrupted him before he could go any further. So you're going to find undertones in this story, and this is something that's going to be interesting to explain, I think. So some of you know me and some of you do not know me, and those who do will find that I'm a very spiritual person, but I'm not a Christian. I do believe... Are you okay, puppy? What are you doing, buddy? Sitting up in his bed coughing at me. I do believe that there is something greater than us out there. I don't know what it is. I do believe in the universe. There's some sort of being or power that doesn't control it and doesn't control us, but that there is more going on than we can explain with our limited understanding of the universe. Let's put it that way. There are things that happen that we cannot explain with science or with our knowledge of how things work. So whether they really are or not, those things get chalked up to a higher power. So you're going to find this book laced with themes like that. The appearance of a man in this town who was awake and could take this family in, and then also has a way to get them on their way, get them across the river. That is a very sort of not necessarily miracle aspect, but one of those aspects that there is something out there looking out for John and John's family. So you're going to find that throughout this book. Now, John's family, they are Christians. They most of the people in this book are, and I'm not. So, but my family isn't. I have a background in Catholicism and whatnot. So, you're going to find that interlaced in this book too, and with the intent of this is what these people believe, and part of it is similar to what I believe, and so that's going to be worked into the story in some cases, but not always, because none of those things work exactly the way we want them to. So now we're moving into chapter 16. Benjamin Franklin said that the founders gave us a republic if we could keep it. Keeping it is the key. You can't just sit back, vote for whatever politician sounds good, and hope for the best. We're where we are because people got complacent. People stopped paying attention to what was going on. They stopped talking to each other and allowed politics to become some sort of taboo. It's my hope that if America is ever restored, people will remember how easily she was lost. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. That's a very short excerpt, and to me was one of the more important ones to write, because no matter what your political beliefs are or what side of the fence you sit on, those words are very true for everybody. You can't just vote for who you think sounds good and hope for the best and expect to do that every time and get anything better out of it. Sometimes you have to vote for change and drastic change, and sometimes you have to vote for people you're not comfortable voting for, and sometimes you have to shake it up a little bit, because if you are complacent, if we as a people are complacent in our voting and our expectations from our politicians, they're going to be complacent in their delivery. If there is no challenge to somebody getting your vote, if they believe that your vote is secured because it always has been, they will never do anything to ensure that you keep that up. Why should they? You're just going to vote for them because they have the right letter after their name. If you keep doing that, then you're just going to keep getting more of the same, and then eventually we're going to wind up here. We're going to wind up in a society where nobody talks about politics. Tribalism is the rule of the day. Your team is better than their team, and you'll never not vote for your team, so your team will never have to worry about making sure that you are taken care of, because why should they if you're just going to vote for them anyway? So this was a very important point that I put in there, a very important, I think, what could help possibly lead to some pretty awful changes in our world. I don't think we'll ever get to the extreme that I created in this fiction here, but I think things could get a lot worse, and I think by doing this it could get substantially worse. So anyway, all right, sir, I think you should see this, Foster called from a few feet away. Lieutenant Casey was overseeing the search of a small abandoned park in Stewart. The sky was overcast, so he was pushing his unit to complete the search before a heavy rain washed away any evidence. His men had finally tracked the path of the van from the NUBD office to the overgrown lot. The impression of the tires were clearly visible in the flattened grass where the vehicle had been driving over the dew-softened ground. We're going to take where the vehicle rolled. Tires rolled over the dew-softened ground. Casey was close to piecing together the entire timeline from the escape of the Evermans to the van being abandoned. There was one more lead to follow, some vague clue about a cabin in the woods near Stewart, but he was confident that they would have the whole story soon. So Casey and his team, they are the federal agents who are trying to, they're the catalyst that sparked this exodus, in a way, but they're also, Casey is also the man charged with finding them and bringing them back. So that's where we are. We are now shifting gears to a scene with the investigators trying to find Everman, John Everman, and his family and friends. What is it, Foster? Casey said without looking up from the section of ground he was searching. A strange report out of Quincy. Locals called into the Peoria office about a shooting, Foster reported. A shooting? Casey looked up in surprise. Yes, sir. Foster flipped through the pages he was holding. Here it is. Last night, a Homeland Security officer was shot and killed on the Bay Bridge in Quincy. That's the bridge. Okay, so that's the bridge that I was talking about. It's called the Bay Bridge. Killed on the Bay Bridge in Quincy. Seems he was able to set off the alarm at his station, but when the local officers arrived, all they found was the body. It's believed that whoever did it crossed to the west side of the bridge and escaped. Okay, I want to make sure. Shot and killed him. Seems he was able to set off the alarm at his station. Okay. Might be our fugitives, Casey said excitedly. Have they searched the town yet? Foster flipped to another page. Yes, sir. They searched the immediate area around the bridge that night. A more thorough search of the town is underway, but they haven't found anything yet. Have our squads found anything north of the abandoned van? Casey asked. No, sir. Nothing that leads me to believe that 4 people are on foot walking north, much less more than 50. Call them back in, Casey said. They won't find anything. Tell them to drive on through to Quincy. We'll meet them there. Yes, sir. All right. So Casey's on to him. The shooting on the bridge and the alarm has given them away. I'm gonna check messages here and see if anything has popped up from you all. You guys are awesome. I always get a few tweets and responses. Nice. Thank you for liking the post, Holly, if you're watching. Just checking other places. Alright, so that's up. Alright, so here we go. So we're skipping scene. The sun was starting to set while John and the others sat nervously in Jacob's living room. Todd and Steve watched the street from different windows, and Amanda did her best to keep the kids occupied during the wait. Everyone was tired, having only managed to get a little sleep during the day. No one had been able to relax. No one was able to relax, however, since the local police had come knocking. The officer had tried to use had and that infrequently. It's really easy, especially because that's really common in conversational English, just like really and very and totally and all of that. But you want to cut that out of your prose. You don't, the economy of words. So going through it and cutting out all the hads and that's and all of that, if you can, is key. Key to making a very slim text. The officer questioned Jacob about whether he saw anyone suspicious or not. No, we're going to leave that. Question the officer about whether he'd seen anyone suspicious or not, but thankfully he wasn't interested in searching the house. The entire group was on edge the rest of the day. Jacob, you should come with us, John suggested while they waited for Steve to tell them it was dark enough to move. He'd already offered once, but the old man refused. Bah, too old for all of that. I'd just slow you down, Jacob said seriously. Besides, the boat's already going to be overcrowded. What if they find the boat and track it back to you? John asked. Not that stupid, son. That boat's not registered to anyone, Jacob explained. Let's go with that. Whoops. You put your life on the line for complete strangers. Isn't there anything we can do to repay you? John asked. Consider it the last bit of fight in a tired old man, Jacob began. That's what I am, tired and old. I've fought all these battles already, and I just can't do it anymore. I've fought all these battles already, and I just can't do it anymore. John nodded in understanding. He couldn't fault Jacob for wanting to be left out of it now. Fighting against something that you know you can't change takes a lot out of a person. I think it's safe to go, Steve said from the window overlooking the street. The small party collected their packs and gear, and Jacob led them to the back door. John took another minute to look out the window into the backyard and surrounding lot. He didn't see any movement, so he opened the door and directed the others to the heavy shadows behind a nearby building. Before joining them, John turned to Jacob. Thank you, John said simply. Thank me by getting that family of yours somewhere safe. Jacob cuffed John on the shoulder and held out his hand. John shook the offered hand. If you ever find a way to Texas, look us up. Will do. Now head straight for the river. The old boat is hidden in the overgrown brush by the water. Should be plenty of gas in the motor to get you across, Jacob said. John nodded his understanding. Go north around the island. There is a narrow cut just this side of the old rail bridge. From there it should be easy to find your way, Jacob finished. John nodded and turned to join the others. He led them to the river without looking back. He felt guilty about leaving Jacob after all the old man was doing for them. But Jacob was right. John had more important things to worry about than one man who had already made his decision. He couldn't force Jacob to go, and John's family and friends needed all of his attention to get them to safety. They walked for several minutes in the dark, carefully navigating the abandoned industrial area between Jacob's house and the river. The streets they crossed were dark and empty. With the normal curfew and the added tension of police searches all day, the city was quiet enough that the small band of refugees felt like the only people in the world. We're just going to say that they felt like the only people in the world. We already know who we're talking about, so we don't need to add to that. It wasn't long before they heard the sound of small waves lapping at the rocks along the bank of the river. The group crossed several sets of railroad tracks into the small park that bordered the water. Much of what had once been beautiful landscape was overgrown into a small wild forest. John's group searched for several minutes but saw no sign of the boat. In a brief moment of panic, he looked around, wondering what they would do if the boat had already been found and confiscated. They couldn't swim the river, and crossing the bridge was out of the question. Perhaps they could cross at Hannibal, but that would be more dangerous. Dad, what's this over here? Thomas called from a few yards away. John ran over and found Thomas pointing into a large tangle of ivy and shrubs. The corner of a flat-bottomed fishing boat was protruding from the overgrowth. Well done, buddy. John patted his son on the back. Thomas beamed at the praise. Todd, Steve, give me a hand with this, John called softly. The three men pulled the small boat out of the brush. They looked it over for holes, but didn't see any. None of them knew a thing about boats, so they couldn't be sure, but it looked like it was in decent shape. And we're going to make that a contraction. John took a look at the motor and realized it started up much like a lawnmower. I think this will work, John said to the others. Let's get it into the water and see if it leaks. They carried it to the water, and John climbed in while the others held it near the shore. John used the dim moonlight to inspect the inside of the boat again. He noticed a small trickle of water coming in at the bottom, but he guessed it wouldn't be enough to worry about. Jacob had been right, though. He said the boat was small. It would be a tight fit for all 6 of them. The rest of the group climbed into the boat, except for Steve, who held it in place while John figured out the motor. A few minutes of poking around revealed the release to lower the propeller into the water, after which John got started on the pull cord. It was a bit harder to start than a lawnmower, but after a few tries he got it running. The sound of the motor firing was louder than John expected, and they all looked to the city in alarm. Get in quick, John said to Steve. He was sure that someone had heard the motor start up. Steve pulled himself over the side of the boat, nearly capsizing the craft. They managed to shift their weight to account for the sudden dip, and Steve tumbled into the bottom of the boat without further incident. John pushed the lever on the motor to turn the nose of the boat north. We're going to change that to vessel. He kept... How are we going to change that? Remove boat. He kept the bow, which is the front of the boat, aimed to cross the narrow channel as Jacob had directed, keeping it closer to the island. They could see... keeping it close to the island, they could just see by the dim moonlight. Okay, so let me read that again. John pushed the lever on the motor to turn the nose of the vessel north. He kept the bow aimed to cross the narrow channel as Jacob had directed, keeping it close to the island they could just see by the dim moonlight. Okay, that sounds a little better. Alright. Several minutes passed before they saw the bulk of the old rail bridge rising out of the dark water. They were close to the point where Jacob had told them to cross, and John glanced back at the city. He could easily make out the red and blue lights of patrol cars near where they had entered the river. His anxiety was relieved a little when they realized that the channel and the buildings in the city were creating an echo that would make it hard to determine exactly where the sound of their motor was coming from. He hoped the local police pinpointed where they were. He hoped they could get across the river and away from the boat before the local police pinpointed where they were going. Alright, so now everybody's made it out of Quincy, and they're in Missouri, but we're still separated. Okay, so a couple changes there for Chapter 17's journal entry. Alright, so we're going to start on Chapter 17. Thanks for joining, whoever's here. If you are watching on Frags and Beer Live or on Mixer, be sure to drop something in the chat, ask questions. This is an interactive show, so let me know what you think, or if you have any questions about this process or what I'm doing here, what am I even doing, and I'll do my best to answer. The environmentalists got a rude awakening during the early part of the transformation. All of the years of eco-terror protests and property damage were largely overlooked before, due to all the money and votes fed into Washington. Once the government had total power, they didn't need the votes anymore. Soon they wouldn't need the money either, but that was a surprise of a different color. When all the other lobbies were kicked out of Washington, the environmental lobby thought they were still in tight with the politicians. They found out they were wrong when they got the boot as well. You see, those Green Planet politicians who flew in private jets every week, lived in huge mansions that sucked power and ate expensive foods, flowed in from all around the world, really only believed in one thing. So that sentence really doesn't work. So you see, those Green Planet politicians who flew in private jets really only believe... We're going to take out a lot of this bulk. Let's try that. You see, those Green Planet politicians who flew in private jets every week really only believed in one thing. They wanted votes, and as long as they had a following of people that believed they were going to change the world, they would get those votes. Once there was no need for votes, there was no need for the act. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. Hey, welcome, Keiko. This is stuck. There we go. Glad to have ya. So, I think you were here last week, where we ended with them, the gunshot on the bridge, and John's running back. John found his family in Quincy, and they're separated from the main group, but he did find his family. He got some help, and they're crossed into Missouri now. So we're progressing further west. It didn't take long to cross the river in the boat. As Jacob had advised, John steered the old craft slightly upriver so they wouldn't drift too much. Once they reached the other bank and all climbed out, John and Steve pushed the boat back into the current. Once they reached the other bank, they all climbed out. Let's do that. This is a huge run-on sentence, I think. They all climbed out. Period. John and Steve pushed the boat back into the current, something Jacob also advised. John had argued that they could hide Jacob's boat so he could retrieve it, but the old man had waved that off as nonsense. He had said the boat did him no good anymore, and it was best served as a distraction somewhere downriver. They ran west as fast as they could in the dark. John wanted to get as far away from the river and bridge as they could before turning south. He didn't know how far the feds would expand the search and would rather push hard to catch up with the main group than risk capture west of the river. A few hours after leaving the river and turning south, they came close to the highway that led back into Quincy. John left the others in the trees and crossed the ditch to the old stretch of blacktop. He stayed low, exiting the tree line and crossing the overgrown ditch. He leaned against the embankment and concentrated, listening and straining his eyes in the direction of the town. They were too far away to see the lights on the bridge, and John didn't see any headlights coming their way. He waved the others up and started them across the highway one at a time. The crossing didn't take long, but for John it seemed like an eternity. He was anxious every time he waved someone across, watching the highway and praying that none of the local police decided to look this far from the city. Finally, when everyone was across and in the opposite ditch, John stood and started to rush across himself. Something seen out of the corner of his eye made him stop and look back toward Quincy. The thought he thought, yeah, I did that wrong. He thought he had seen, he thought he saw a flash. A slight flash of red blew over the hill to the east. He froze for a moment, not wanting to believe what he was seeing. His lapse passed, and he ran to the others and dropped down into the ditch with them. "What's the matter?" Amanda said. John was looking out into the field south of the highway, looking like a rabbit that had been spotted by the hounds. He soon saw what he was looking for and stood up, pointing toward a barn a 100 yards away. "There," he said. "Run. We're not out of this yet." Okay. So we're going to go there. We're not out of this yet. All right. None of them needed any further urging. They were starting to hear the sound of sirens in the distance and closing fast. That doesn't make sense. They were starting to hear the sound of sirens in the distance closing fast. The adults each grabbed one of the younger kids with them, and the group ran for the barn in the distance. The ground was flat with no cover. John prayed the officers didn't use their searchlights. The patrol cars passed by on the highway as the refugees ran for the barn. When John's group reached the old building, they were all out of breath and their muscles burned with the exertion. Todd found them a way in, and they all collapsed in the dry hay that was piled in a corner. The odor of musty air and rat droppings permeated the building, but the protective walls in warm hay were comforting. "We'll stay here until tomorrow evening." Let's make this a contraction. "We'll stay here until tomorrow evening," John said when he caught his breath. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch first." Okay. Whoops. Alright, so they found a hiding place, but they're still separated from the rest of their group. The others just nodded and made themselves more comfortable. John kissed Amanda and his kids and took Steve's rifle. He moved toward the side of the barn facing the road and found a small hole in the wall that gave him a view of the highway and the field between it and the barn. John kissed Amanda and his kids. I don't think we need a comma there. And took Steve's rifle. Okay. So changing scenes now again. "What have you found out?" Lieutenant Casey was standing in the dingy office of the chief of Quincy Police. He didn't much care for the local law enforcement, nor could he understand why they had not been. No, so that works. Nor could he understand why they had not been absorbed. You know what I'll do though? Let's make that a contraction. No, that won't work. That won't work. Hold on. He didn't much care for local law enforcement. Or could he understand why They had not been absorbed into the federal police force. Yeah, that'll probably work. That's how they've been. Okay, we'll stick with that for now. The search of the town had turned up nothing. Oh, the guy's talking. All right. Backtrace. Let me take a drink. As you can tell, I'm not a voice actor and I don't read out loud often, so. The search of the town has turned up nothing, the balding police chief said. He shuffled some reports in his hands. Every house within a few minutes of the bridge has been searched. No unauthorized inhabitants. So you have nothing to report. Casey was barely holding on to the leash that kept his temper in check. The chief looked a little uncomfortable answering to a federal officer about the abilities of his men. There is a report here. A motor was heard on the river during the night. There was no visual identification, but the officer is pretty sure it was a boat. The chief read a few more lines of the report to himself before continuing. The boat was found a mile down the river this morning on the western bank. There were no prints in the area and the boat was empty. So it is the policy of this department to assume that boats start up their own motors and cross the river themselves. Casey could no longer contain his anger. Of course not. The police chief was taken aback. Are your men searching the bank on both sides of the bridge? Casey asked hotly. Well, no. Oh, wait a minute. But the boat, the chief stammered. They found the boat on the south side of the bridge. Idiot, Casey exploded. Get your men and search the banks up and down river. I will coordinate a search of the residences on the west side of the river. West side of the water. West side of the bridge. Let's do that. West side of the bridge. That sounds... I will coordinate a search of the residents on the west side of the bridge. Casey didn't wait for a response. He pulled his jacket on and stormed out of the office. On his way through the lobby of the police station, he signaled his men to follow him out into the van. He climbed into the passenger seat and immediately got on the radio. Foster, Casey said after he keyed up the mic. Yes, Lieutenant. Split the men into groups of 2. Commandeer whatever vehicles you need and get them across the river. I want every house, barn, and grain silo searched for the fugitives. Some of them crossed the river last night in a small boat, so there won't be many. Excuse me. Yes, sir, Foster responded. Let's go. Take us across the river, Casey said to the officer in the driver's seat. John, he was being shaken awake. What is it? John sat up and shaded his eyes against the bright sun coming in through the cracks in the barn's walls. I think we'd better get out of here, Steve said quietly. He turned and pointed to the wall of the barn facing a house across the field. John crossed to the wall, stumbling a little in the deep hay, and looked out through a large crack. Parked in the driveway of the small farmhouse was a black van. A man in a black suit was talking to a little old lady who was still wearing her white housecoat. John couldn't hear what they were saying, of course, but he had a good idea that what they were talking about. He knew there was no time to figure out what was going on. He had to get everyone out of the barn and away from the farm right away. John rushed to the opposite wall and searched frantically for some way out of the barn that couldn't be seen from the house. It didn't take him long to find a loose board near another. A loose board that had been broken sometime in the past. Yeah, that works better. The others were starting to wake up, and John tried to calm down, but his sense of panic was already Does it really want to make this one word possible? No, that's right. Broken some time in the past. Not sometime, but, well, maybe. Broken sometime in the past. No, that's right. Okay. The others were starting to wake up. John tried to calm down his sense of panic, but his sense of panic was already noticed. Let's fix that. John tried to calm himself down, but his sense of panic was already noticed. Amanda looked scared and the children were getting anxious. I'm going to change that. I don't like the sense of his wife. His wife was never really one to be scared by something like this. Amanda looked nervous, looked concerned, and the children were getting anxious. Quickly, over here, John called urgently but quietly. Steve grabbed their packs and handed them to the owners, pushing each member of their small group toward John. You first, Todd. Make sure it's safe. John gestured for Todd while he pushed out on the board, making the hole big enough for the man. They all waited nervously after Todd crawled through the small hole. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he came back and whispered that his side of the barn was safe. Go. Run for those trees as soon as you are out, John gestured to Amanda. You kids follow your mom. Steve, who had been watching the house, came rushing over to John just as Susan was getting through the gap. We gotta hurry. The feds are coming this way, Steve said. You're next, Steve, John said to his friend. Steve didn't hesitate. He dropped low and pulled himself through the gap. John saw his hands take over pulling on the board from the other side, and he followed his friend as fast as he could. Once they were through, the refugees made a dash for the trees. I'm going to put a comma there because they aren't going through the refugees. So that makes a little more sense. Okay. So they're really close to being caught. Let's see, where's chapter 19? Okay, so we're going to break the scene there, break the tension a little bit. Hopefully that works. So chapter 18. Conspiracy theorists, fearmongers, seditious, peddlers of hate, snake oil salesmen were just a few of the accusations laid at the feet of people that tried to warn us of what was coming. They were attacked by the people who were blind, complacent, or complicit in regards to the changes that were right before us. The number of people that denied anything was wrong can be excused as human nature, but there was a vast portion of the population taken by surprise when it was all said and done. Most of those I could not excuse, because once they realized what was happening, they turned on the same people that tried to warn them. They demanded to know why someone didn't try harder to warn people. Why didn't anyone make it easier to see or simpler to understand? They wanted to blame everyone but themselves. And for them, I say, you get the government you deserve. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. So yeah, that one's kind of I'm not sure I like that journal entry, and I may go back and rewrite that one. It's a little bit clusterfucky, I guess you could say. Yeah, it just doesn't make a whole ton of sense, but I'm not really sure what I want it to go for right there. Just a few of the accusations laid at the feet of people that tried to warn us about the government. Warn us about the government. Let's go ahead and fix it now. Conspiracy theorist, fearmonger, seditious. Let's go ahead and take seditious out, because nobody really uses that word, but people do call other people conspiracy theorists all the time. Peddlers of hate, snake oil salesmen. Just a few of the accusations laid at the feet of the people that tried, laid at the feet of people who tried. Yeah, that you don't use that when you're talking about people who tried to warn us about the government. I have a bad habit of not using who instead of. They were attacked by people who are blind, complacent, or complicit in regards to the changes that were happening right before us. The number of people that denied anything was wrong can be excused as human nature, but there was a vast portion of the population. See, this is a sentence that doesn't make sense. Okay. I could excuse some of the people. Human nature as a way of accepting accepting unpleasant human nature has a way of accepting unpleasantness, I guess you could say, for a long time. Let's do that. We're going to go ahead and completely change this journal entry. Many I could not excuse. Excuse though. because once they realized what was happening, they turned on the same people that tried to warn them. They demanded, okay, so this might actually make more sense now. Conspiracy theorists, fearmongers, peddlers of hate, and snake oil salesmen were just a few of the accusations laid at the feet of people who tried to warn us about the government. They were attacked by others who were blind, complacent, or complicit in regards to the changes that were happening right in front of us. It's like a little less formal. Right in front of us. Oh, spell front, right? I could excuse some of the people. Human nature has a way of accepting unpleasantness for a long time. Many, not Manny. I couldn't excuse, though. Because they realized what was... Because once they realized what was happening, they turned on the same people that tried to warn them. They demanded to know why someone didn't try harder to warn people. Try harder to... Try to tell them. Let's go with that. Come on, select the word. They demanded to know why someone didn't try harder to warn people. Why didn't anyone make it easier to see or simpler to understand? They wanted to blame everyone but themselves, and for them, I say, you get the government you deserve. Okay, I like that a little better. It makes sense. Yeah, they caught it too. Manny. And you know what's killing me is I'm using Word Online, which isn't terrible, but there's a slight delay. So if you type really fast and you're using the online version of Word through Microsoft site, if you type super fast and you pay attention to the screen as you're typing, you'll sometimes hit a key and it won't register, and you think it didn't register, so you hit it again, and you wind up double typing a lot. So if you do use Word Online, which is completely free, I use it through my Hotmail account, so it's actually kind of nice to use, but bear in mind that delay, especially if you're a really fast typer, and normally under normal circumstances I'm about a 70-80 word per minute typer, and Word Online cannot keep up with that, so it'll be almost an entire word behind sometimes when I'm writing. And if you're watching the screen as you type, that could really screw you up. So something to remember. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I've used Google Drive too. And the only reason I use this as opposed to Google Drive is because when you submit, a lot of times they want a Word doc. And I also use this. I have an older version of Word on my PC that works on Windows 7, but my laptop does not have that version of Word installed, so I use the online version so that I can write on my laptop but also write on my desktop, or write from work, or wherever I'm at. I can just launch my laptop and connect and work without having to, in the old days I had to use a flash drive or a disk to keep my book on and carry it with me everywhere. So if I wanted to work when I was out somewhere, I'd have to plug it into my laptop and write, and that way I could keep an updated version of my work. But now having it online is awesome, but yeah, there's a bit of a delay. It's kind of goofy. All right, now we're switching scenes again. While John and the others were stuck in Quincy, Benny pushed the refugees through that first day after crossing the river and well into the night. Pushed the refugees through that first day after crossing the river and well into the night. The non-store version of OneNote. OneNote is compatible with Word, isn't it? If I remember right, I think you can... Or I think it's part of the same suite of applications. I don't know. I've never used OneNote. I know people who have used it, but I've never used it myself. I think it's actually part of the same application suite. But I've not tried it yet myself to see. I've also not tried like Scrivener or any of the writing applications out there, because some of them are pretty costly. And this works pretty well for me right now. So when they finally stopped, everyone was on the verge of collapse. During the day's work, they heard sirens far to the north, near the highway and the bridge. During the day's walk, they heard sirens far to the north, near the highway and the bridge. Everyone was nervous and constantly looking back. Benny knew they didn't fully trust him, because not all of them know Benny, keep in mind. Benny knew they didn't fully trust him, and the shooting on the bridge only served to strengthen that distrust. He urged them on anyway, knowing that John was depending on him to get everyone to Texas. We're going to take out that there. That there, that. Take it out. Economy of words. After they stopped for the night and settled in, Benny noticed a group standing together and talking excitedly. The way they kept looking over at him, gave Benny a pretty good idea what the subject of their conversation was. He acted as if he didn't notice. Letting them gather the courage to say whatever it was they wanted to say to him. He sat where he was, chewing on the jerky from his ration pack. It didn't take long before the group approached him. Benny, we've been thinking, the group's spokesman started. We think it's a good idea to wait for John. It's what he would do for us. Benny looked at each of them in turn, measuring their resolve by whether they looked him in the eye or not. None of them did. Carl, right? The man said. The man nodded. The man was their appointed spokesman, but Benny... Let's go ahead and change this, because now we know his name. Carl, or Coral, was their appointed spokesman, but Benny could tell he didn't want the task. John had a rule about waiting for anyone when you got to my cabin, right? Yes, but we were all there, so we don't really know if he would have stuck to that, Carl said. Benny nodded, and Carl relaxed a little, thinking that Benny was seeing his point. Benny stood up, and Carl took an involuntary step back. The grizzly recluse was a head taller than anyone else, and an intimidating figure even under the best of circumstances. How long do you intend to wait? Benny asked. Well, we figure that John could only be a couple of days behind us at most, Carl said, more unsure of himself now. John had a rule about... Something didn't sound right up here. Hold on. Yes, but we're all there, so we don't... Yes, but we were all there, so we don't really know if he would have stuck to that. I don't think we need that comma there. Yes, but we were all there, so we don't really know if he would have stuck to that or not. Would have stuck to that. Okay, yeah, that'll work. Okay. What if they were caught? Benny asked. How long do you intend to put your friends in danger by sitting in one place? Carl looked down at the ground, his hands anywhere but at the bearded men questioning him. Finally he asked, how can we just leave him behind? We do what we have to. Everyone else is counting on that. Benny put his hand on Carl's shoulder. They are counting on you, Carl. They don't trust me. We can't risk everyone here for just a few people. Carl nodded and looked up at the bearded man's face. Benny nodded and cuffed his shoulder. Go pray for them, Carl, and have a little faith in John. I believe the man upstairs is looking out for him, Benny said. So there again is sort of that reference to, I mean, remember that these people, a lot of these people are going to be Christian. They're going to have faith, even when I don't, or when I'm not Christian particularly, or every reader's not going to be. It's important not to gloss over that sometimes. You don't want that to be hidden just because it's an uncomfortable subject matter, just like anything else. Benny watched the group disperse and go back to their sleeping spots. He said a little prayer himself, hoping that John and the others were safe. He was worried about them, but the rest of their group didn't need to see it. They needed a confident leader to take John's spot and get them safely to Texas. He settled back on his blanket, looking at the trees, and finally drifted off to sleep. But it must have decided to offer free. Oh, cool. Yeah, I might have to check that out because I think OneNote's available mobile too, which could make it easy to keep track of things when I actually don't have access to a computer or my work. I might be able to, because I keep a notebook, like pretty much. I don't have it on me, but whenever I leave the house, I keep a very small notebook. And this is a tip for writers. I know I don't know. I'm one of those. Oh shoot, I don't have one right in front of me. I usually have some extras laying around, but I always keep a very small field notes book. If you look up field notes books, they're very small ones, pocket sized. I always have one of those, and I always have a pen with me. I always have a way to take notes because I found over the years, I was always looking for scraps of paper and some way to write things down. I was shoving in my pockets, and I'd get home and empty my pockets, and before long I had stacks of all these little scraps of paper and stuff where I'd written notes on. But that became unmanageable, obviously. So now everywhere, every time I leave the house, I carry this little notebook. And then in my writing, I have a backpack that has all of my stuff in it, and in there is my writing book, my journal of notes, that things get transferred to if they're deemed important enough to actually move into there. The characters do their own thing. It's their story to find the action. Yep, absolutely. Definitely let the characters do their own thing. That's one of the things that it's weird as a writer, and people who don't write sometimes don't get it like we do. It's funny when your characters surprise you, like, and somebody's like, I've had people say, well, how can your characters surprise you? You're writing the story. They're doing everything you're telling them to do, but it's such a weird concept to describe. But when you create a character and you're like, okay, this is how this character behaves, and you're writing your story, and all of the sudden you have written your character into a scene where you're not really sure what they'll do, and then suddenly the way you've created that character's personality or their background gives you the answer, and you're surprised by that answer. So in a way, you're surprised by the actions of your characters, even though you're writing every one of those actions yourself. They can surprise you, and you definitely want to keep that stuff fluid. You want to be able to adapt to that. Like, I'm not sure, Keiko, if you were here for early in the last episode, but when they got to the bridge in Quincy, I had planned, I thought I knew what the bridge in Quincy looked like in my head. So I had them walking along the river to get on the bridge and cross the bridge. And then when I looked at Google Maps for that Bay Bridge in Quincy, the actual real bridge, and I realized that the ramp for the bridge actually starts like 2 blocks into the town. So if you're walking along the river's edge, you can't get on the bridge. It's too high. And I thought, well, I got to fix this. How am I going to fix this? And instead of rewriting the whole scene and having John walking 2 blocks in the city to get to, because John knew it, I just said, well, I didn't know that off the top of my head. So let's say John doesn't know that off the top of his head. And how is John going to figure this out now? John assumed that the bridge started at the water's edge, like any person not really thinking about it might think, like I thought. And once he actually got there, he realized, oh, crap. It doesn't start at the water's edge. He has to plan a way into the city without getting caught and then up the bridge. So definitely keep that sort of fluid thing. Those mistakes are good things because they make your writing a little more honest rather than your characters always having the right answer, always knowing how things need to be, and so forth. So it's always a good thing to be adaptive to when you write yourself into a corner and then you have to come up with a solution. Make it part of the story. Don't just rewrite it because all of a sudden you found yourself stuck in a weird spot. Try to make it part of your story. All right, stop. Federal police. The shout rang out across the field, so we changed scenes again. Shout rang out across the fields, chasing John and the others into the trees. They all ran faster, but John knew it was only a matter of time. The feds had the trail, and they were too close. Steve seemed to realize this at the same time John did, and he turned back toward the officers and raised his rifle. He fired a shot that went wild, and the officers raced for cover behind the barn. "What are you doing?" John asked, reaching for Steve's rifle. "Go, John. I'll buy us some time." Let's change that. It won't be so formal there. He's speaking fast too. "Go, John. I'll buy us some time." Steve pushed John away and took aim at the barn. He fired a shot, barely missed the officer that was peeking around the corner. "Damn it, Steve, they're too close. We won't be fast enough with the children." John reached for the rifle again and got a grip on the barrel. The two men struggled over the weapon, but Steve proved the stronger and pulled hard, taking control of the rifle again. Taking control of it again. We've already said rifle twice. He stepped back and started to turn toward the barn, waving John off. When the next shot went off, John wondered why Steve had... Okay, so when the next shot went off, John wondered why Steve had fired without taking aim. Time slowed as realization set in, and John ran toward Steve. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, only that he had to save his friend from what he knew was coming. The first shot hit Steve in the left shoulder. John found himself horrified and fascinated at the same time as the sun shimmered through the mist of blood that followed the bullet out of Steve's back. Steve turned slightly toward John, turned slightly toward his friend, a look of confusion on his face. The second round hit Steve in the chest before he even started to fall. John saw his friend convulse slightly when he was hit, and a dark spot blossomed on his shirt just under his right collarbone. John reached out, but there was nothing he could do to stop Steve from falling to the ground. Time sped up way too fast for John at that point. He hit his knees beside his best friend, reaching frantically to stop the bleeding. He pressed on the chest wound, but he couldn't keep the blood from coming out, and the pressure just caused Steve to cough blood from his mouth. John could hear the officers running in their direction, shouting something, but he couldn't hear them over the roar in his ears. Someone was screaming far away, but he couldn't tell who. His attention was on Steve, whose eyes were focused on something far away. "Come on, buddy, hang in there," John said. He repeated the words "hang in there" like some sort of prayer, as if saying them over and over would help. Steve finally seemed to react to John's presence, turning his head toward the sound of his voice. Their eyes locked for the briefest of moments, and Steve smiled slightly, as if all the pain and suffering had left him in that instant. Then it was all gone. The spark that told John his friend was still alive was gone. The world came crashing back to John as he was knocked to the ground. One of the officers had pushed him into the dirt and had a knee on the middle of his back. "Put it down," the officer above him was shouting. John could hear his wife sobbing and Susan was screaming. He couldn't see the scene with his eyes, but he didn't need to. "Todd, put it down," John shouted from his position, his voice raw from the tears he now felt running down his face. "For the sake of the children, put it down." All right, so that was a tough scene to write. It's hard. It's another one of those things that when you write, you get it. When you don't write, sometimes it's hard to explain. But when you have to do painful things to your characters, it's not always fun, but it has to be done. You have to give your characters have to experience that, and you have to show your audience that your characters can experience that, or they won't believe it. If I made this journey for John and his friends without danger or peril, I would slowly lose the audience's belief that there was anything that could really be done to stop them, or that there was any real need to worry that they would succeed. That's been sort of a beef I've had with some writing in some movies, and especially comic books over the last few years, is in some cases you have no reason to care because you know that the characters you're reading about, pardon me, I think something flew into my mouth. You have no reason to believe that the characters you're reading about could fail, and so you have no reason to care. The biggest example is my favorite comic book character of all time is Wolverine. I love the way Wolverine is written. I love his aesthetic. I love the way he looks and the backstory, and I love everything about Wolverine except for the fact that when you read a Wolverine story, there's really no reason to care, at least about Wolverine, because he can't die, and no matter what happens to him, there's no reason to worry about it. And so when they did kill him off this last time, if you're not familiar with Marvel Comics, about 2 years ago there was a Death of Wolverine comic again. Wolverine died again. And this time I finally went, you know what, he's my favorite character and I would hate to not ever read about him again, but please leave him dead. I wanted the story that I read in the Death of Wolverine comic, and I wanted the stories I read after that, the effect it had on his friends. I wanted those stories to mean something. And now they're bringing him back. So those stories don't mean anything anymore. And when you read Wolverine going forward, after they bring him back, why do you have a reason to care about him? Because he can just come back. Who cares if he dies? Who cares if he's in danger? Because nothing will ever happen to him. So be sure that if your story, your book, your short, whatever, involves danger, or you want to give your audience a sense of real peril, if it's that kind of story, you need to have that in there. There has to be a real reason to care. There has to be real stakes. So don't forget that. Don't make every character perfect, and don't make every character survive and come through it unscathed, or you'll lose your audience. So it's a hard scene to write. I hated writing that scene, and I hate writing the scenes that come after this because of this scene. But they have to happen, and or your audience won't believe it. They won't buy it at all. Chapter 19. Most people didn't believe in the re-education camps. They didn't want to believe that our government would round people up and send them away. Some of us believed it, though. It happened before. Why not now? Once the government had full control of the country, they didn't need to hide their dirty little secret anymore. They even tried to make it sound like a good thing with advertising. We started seeing posters and ads claiming that the camps were just schools, making people better citizens for tomorrow. The abductions were just shrugged off as the government tried to help people that wouldn't help themselves. The magic words were spoken. People would accept just about anything if it was for the greater good. So those are the magic words, the greater good. I wrote that in there because I believe there are two really dangerous phrases that people in power like to use to justify things. When you hear these two phrases, you need to pay very close attention to the person who's saying them. For your own good or for the greater good. I believe both of those are the same phrase, and I'd be the super dangerous. For the greater good. A lot of awful things have been justified for the greater good. And the other one is for our children, or thinking of our children, or in any way evoking the younger generation. A lot of awful things have been done in the name of protecting our children. I'm not saying those are always bad phrases, but I'm saying pay very close attention to people when they say those things. They are not always honest about why they're using that phrase. So that's why that's there, and why I put that in that particular entry. The interrogation room was stark and cold. Drab, gray walls, stainless steel table and chairs, and a large mirror were the only points of interest. John was alone in the room, handcuffed to the table. He'd been separated from the rest of the group, so he had no idea where the others were taken. He hadn't felt so alone at any other time in his life, and the idea that Amanda and the children might be feeling the same angered him. John had been sitting alone long enough for the cold floor to chill his feet, the hard metal chair to hurt his back. He was sure that everything that was being done to him since being brought back to Quincy was intentional. He sat straight in the hard chair, staring down at his hands, clasped on the table, determined not to show any sign of discomfort. I'm going to change. It's a bit of a... I do have a tendency to make very long sentences. He was determined not to show any signs of discomfort. John kept playing the last moments of Steve's life over and over in his head. The look on his friend's face would haunt him forever. He felt responsible for what happened, and he hated himself for thinking that being captured was a blessing. He couldn't help his sense of relief that he would have to face... He couldn't help his sense of relief that he wouldn't. Oh, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. That sentence is awful. He felt guilty that he was relieved he wouldn't have to tell Steve's wife what happened. Because it's only human. I wrote John to be a very good person, a very conscientious person, but he's human. And if you knew you had to tell your best friend's wife that your best friend died, and you somehow had that responsibility taken away from you involuntarily, I think any normal person would feel a bit of relief. And they'd feel guilty about that relief, but they'd feel it, because nobody wants to be the bearer of that news. The Immortals. I have not. I am familiar with a lot of Hickman's work, but I have not read The Immortals yet. I found so far, at least it's very true with Margaret Weiss, but a couple of Hickman's books that I've read on his own, I found they're not nearly as good separate as they are together. And that may just be because my first introduction to Weiss and Hickman were together through the Dragonlance books and the Deathgate cycle and that kind of stuff. But I've not read the Immortals yet. It's I have seen it. I've met Tracy a couple times and seen all of his books and thought about buying a couple of his standalones, but again, I've found I prefer Weiss and Hickman together much more than I do separately. So I haven't bought a ton of their solo work or even his work with Laura, just because of that. I tend to prefer them together. So after what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than an hour, the room's single door opened and a uniformed federal officer entered. The officer crossed the room and set a folder on the table along with a cup of coffee. The officer didn't look at John. We need to fix that. Or even acknowledge that there was anyone else in the room. He simply sat in the only other chair and started looking through the papers in the folder. Excuse me. I'm going to try to be better about, because I know if you're watching the recording, you can't see the chat, so I need to share the question. So I was just asked if I was familiar with Tracy Hickman's book, The Immortal. That's what that last conversational piece was about. That way, if you guys are watching, you kind of know why I just break off and just start babbling about something else. He said something. Okay. John knew he was being toyed with. He resisted as long as he could, but finally his pain and sorrow got the better of him. The Immortals. Keiko says The Immortals has a really odd writing style and premise. He released a free narrated version over... Oh, interesting. Yeah, he did another one that my wife read, and I can't remember the name of it, which she said was really unusual, and it's a more recent book. I think it was him and Laura had written sort of a pseudo-horror teen thriller book, and I can't remember what it was called. My wife said it was strange. She actually couldn't get into it because of the way it was written, which may be. I've had some authors like that. Like, I can't read Stephen King because of the way Stephen King writes, or at least some of his books. I tried reading Goldeneye. No, it wasn't Goldeneye. I don't know if it's up in my bookshelves. Dragon's Eye. I tried to read Dragon's Eye, and I couldn't get through it. The way it was written just bugged the crap out of me, and so I just couldn't read Dragon's Eye. And I found that some authors just, if their writing style's too weird, I just can't do it. Where's my family? John, let's make that a contraction. John is not having it. He's not speaking formally. Where's my family? John asked quietly, barely above a whisper. The officer responded. Oh, it's a question. The officer responded. I said, where's my family? John looked at the man. Oh, yes. They are safely locked in a cell where they belong, the officer said calmly, as if he was talking about the weather. And Steve? John asked, unable to hide the catch in his throat. The officer looked down at the papers, scanning the one in front of him. Ah, the one that fired at my men. The officer looked up. The body was sent to a disposal facility. Father trying to reconcile with his gay son. Huh. Okay. That sounds like a cool concept for a story. He says The Immortals, Keiko says, The Immortals is about a father trying to reconcile with his gay son at a death camp in a science fiction setting. Sounds like a really cool concept for a story. I could see that being interesting. I could also see that being done very poorly. But it's good that, I can see Tracy hitting that topic pretty well. I always found that and it's an awful word to use now, so I'm not going to use the word progressive, but I always have found the old writers for a lot of D&D stuff to have been ahead of their time when it came to novelization, representation in science fiction and fantasy, and doing it very well. I mean, when you take Weiss and Hickman's books, for example, from the Dragonlance saga, their main heroes were from all races and genders, one of their main heroes was a woman. One of their linchpin characters in the Dragonlance Chronicles was Theros Ironfeld, who is a black man. So I always found them to be very ahead of their time when it came to writing like that. When especially in a time where books were still, where science fiction was still very trying to find its feet as far as, and science fiction was always ahead of its time, I guess you could say. But there was still a period where it was trying to find its groove and trying to find its feet, with all of that. Because oh, I can't remember the guy's name. When, well, one of them was Sprogda Camp, and I'm looking at my books trying to find the name. Was it Robert Howard? When they were writing, and even the guy who wrote the Mars series. You know, their stuff was very much old-fashioned, masculine writing, and it was good stuff, but it was early on in science fiction. It was still trying to find its feet, and then along comes this sort of lighter fantasy genre, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, with Dragonlance and the TSR stuff, and they were trying to change the envelope, change the settings without getting wild and crazy with it, and I think they did very well. So I could see Tracy Hickman wanting to touch on a story like that and probably handling it pretty well, though it sounds like the writing style may have been a little odd, but that I also believe. So very cool. I may have to actually, with all the books I have, I don't know if I would ever be able to get to it, but I will definitely keep it on my radar to at least take a look into. So let's see, where were we here? So yeah, he asked about Steve, and the officer looked up. The body was sent to a disposal facility. John nearly choked on his grief as he imagined the fate of his best friend. He'd once seen a disposal facility where bodies were unceremoniously dumped into large furnaces and cremated. It was the only legal means of handling the dead. Burying them in cemeteries was deemed bad for the environment, too costly, and too time-consuming for the government. Listen, John, Casey said calmly. You can make this easy on yourself and your family. Now, I may actually confuse... Yeah, I haven't revealed his name yet. I don't want to confuse people. Officer said calmly. You can make this easy on yourself and your family. Tell me where the rest of the fugitives plan to cross the border, and we'll send you straight to the re-education camp. Let's fix that. Otherwise, you go to the office in Peoria for thorough interrogation. Listen, officer, John started to say. Did I spell change form and noun? Tell me where the rest of the fugitives plan to cross. No, that's right. Word. Tell me where the rest of the fugitives plan to cross the border, and we'll send you straight. Okay, they're being stupid. Listen, officer, John started to say. Casey, Ben interrupted. Lieutenant Casey. Right, Lieutenant. Look, we aren't going to tell you anything, so you can just do whatever it is you need to do. That's a poorly written sentence that I just put in there. Right, Lieutenant. We're going to make that one sentence. Right. Lieutenant. Look, we aren't going to tell you anything. Period. So, you can just do whatever it is you need to do. Right, Lieutenant. Look, we aren't going to tell you anything. So you can just do whatever it is that you need to do. Alright, that sounds much better. You might change your mind once you get to Peoria, John. Casey rearranged the papers in the file and stood up. Casey looked down at John for a moment, and John met his gaze coldly. John felt something in that look, but it wasn't malice or anger. He could see that the officer truly believed in what he was doing, and that scared John a little. Finally, Casey walked out of the door and left the room. They came for him some time later. John had no idea how long he had been left there. he'd been left there. But he finally fell asleep. He had finally fallen asleep in his chair. The lack of sleep, stress, and the death of his best friend had caught up to him. Someone shook him roughly and told him to get up. With his mind still cloudy and his body in pain from sitting in the metal chair for so long, he got to his feet and stumbled in the direction the two officers directed. Alright, let's go over that paragraph again. That sounds weird. They came for him sometime later. John had no idea how long he'd been left there, but he had finally fallen asleep in his chair. The lack of sleep, stress, and the death of his... Let's do exhaustion. Stress and the death of his best friend had caught up to him. Someone shook him roughly and told him to get up. With his mind still cloudy and his body in pain from sitting in the middle chair for so long, he got to his feet and stumbled in the direction the two officers directed. That sounds much better. Much better paragraph. They pointed down a long, dimly lit hall toward a large metal door. Neither of the officers spoke, and John wasn't about to strike up a conversation. His head felt like someone was hitting him in the temple with a hammer, and at that point, silence was golden. He couldn't help but feel like he was being led to his own execution. When they reached the end of the hall, one of the officers firmly pushed John against the wall while the other unlocked the door with a key from a large steel ring on his belt. The massive door swung open and the smell of a garage swept into the hallway. The smell of exhaust, oil, and gasoline took John back to the day Steve and he stole the work van and escaped Stewart. Memories and feelings he had been trying to bury. Memories and feelings he had been trying to bury flooded to the surface again, and he was swept away by grief and guilt over his friend's death. John was pushed, unresisting, toward the back of a large black van parked several feet away. He was sure the van would take him away from everyone he was sure the van would take him away from everyone, and that he might not see his family or friends again, but he was too exhausted to fight the officers. He was sure the van would take him away from everyone. I don't like that. He was sure the van would take him away from everyone. I know what he was sure. If he got in that van, he wouldn't see his He was sure if he got in that van, he wouldn't see his friends or family or friends again, but he was too exhausted to fight the officers. I like that better. It's a much better sentence, so we're going with that. He knew he should fight tooth and nail to get out, to find his family, but his body ignored get out and find his family. We're going to go over here. He knew he should. He knew he should fight tooth and nail to get out and find his family, but his body ignored the screaming of his mind. He stumbled once against one of the officers, and they both took hold of him by the arms. They practically carried him the rest of the way. When they got to the van, one of the guards reached out and opened the back doors, swinging both of them away from the vehicle. John looked up into the dark interior that suddenly became a chaos of noise as several people began to shout. His heart told him he should recognize the voices, but his mind was still clouded with grief. He was becoming aware that they were shouting his name and holding cuffed hands out to him. The officers lifted him into the van, where he collapsed on his knees on the floor. The closing of the doors seemed to snap John awake, and he looked up into the faces surrounding him. He just reached up to his family, and they joined him on the floor. He wept freely, in relief, as he held his wife and kids. Todd gripped his shoulder, and they all shared a moment of quiet grief. I'll make sure I didn't use the word grief too frequently. For the lost. Okay. Todd gripped his shoulder, and they all shared a moment of quiet grief for the lost and relief to be together. Is everyone all right? John's hoarse voice broke the silence. Amanda met his gaze and nodded. I'm hungry, Susan said quietly. John smiled and hugged her again, holding his child he feared he would never hold again. Nope, had is what he'd feared. We want to change that to contraction. Me too, honey. But we'll have to wait a little longer. Let's make that a contraction as well. I did a really poor job of catching these contractions. And I just fat-fingered 2 keys, which did that. All right. We'll have to wait a little longer, John said reassuringly. He turned to Todd. Did they question you? No, Todd shook his head. We were all kept in a room together for hours. Once, an officer checked on us, but didn't say a word. His uniform made me think he was in charge. Casey, John said and nodded. He questioned me too, but he wasn't too happy about my answers. I think they're taking us to Peoria. With that last statement, he gave a look to both Todd and his wife that let them know he didn't think it would be a good... With that last statement, he gave a look to both Todd and his wife that let them know he didn't think it would be good for them at all. Think it would end well. Let's make this its own sentence. He didn't want to scare the kids, so he didn't elaborate. Nope, that's a double negative. He didn't want to scare the kids. So he no, I don't like that sentence at all. Yeah, that's probably better to go simple sometimes. I like that, Keiko. So he stayed silent. Sometimes going simple is the best way to just put it out there. He didn't want to scare the kids, so he stayed silent. I like that. Thank you. They both seemed to understand, and Amanda held Thomas tighter against her. When the front doors opened, they settled back onto the benches which lined the sides of the van. 2 officers climbed into the front seats. The driver got the van started and used a radio to let the person on the other end know they were ready to leave. The passenger turned and looked back through the grate that divided the front from the prisoner area. He looked at each of them, and John thought he saw a brief look of sympathy in the officer's eyes. When the driver put the radio mic back on its hanger, the passenger turned back to the front and made some notes on a clipboard. The driver put the van in reverse and turned it out of the parking garage. Turned the vehicle out of the parking garage. They exited. Hold on. The driver put the van in reverse. I guess we don't need a comma there. And turned the vehicle out of the parking garage. They exited the structure. No, they exited. We know what they're exiting. They exited into the bright sunlight, and the driver turned onto the highway, leading away from Quincy. And we're going to... I stopped italicizing John's thoughts. Oops. This is it for us, John thought. I hope the others make it. Alright, what time is it? It's actually close to the hour. We might be able to... We're going to do one more chapter, and then we're going to go from there. So now we're going to do chapter 20. They said it would never happen again. can't believe so many people took their word for it. Did everyone forget that it happened before? Maybe people just can't imagine the government of their time can do the same evil as they did in the past. I've come to learn... Whoops. There we go. I've come to learn that government is always the same. The faces change, but the problems are still there. Sometimes they hide it better, sometimes they fool you, but it never really goes away. They came and took it all. Federal officers with orders from the president. Any valuable metal or jewelry, really anything that was worth anything. Claimed it had to become property of the state so everyone could benefit from it. The worst was Grandma's wedding ring and Grandpa's gold coin collection. My grandparents were so proud of those things. Grandpa had saved for a year to buy that diamond ring for Grandma. A large portion of his retirement went into those coins. He hoped they would ensure that his kids and grandkids would never have to worry about the things Grandpa did when he was younger. Oh. That's phrased. He hoped they would ensure that his kids and grandkids would never have the same worries, have to worry about the things Grandpa did when he was younger. Yeah, we're going to change that. Worried about when he was younger. He hoped they would ensure that his kids and grandkids would never have to worry about the things Grandpa worried about when he was younger. Yeah, that makes more sense. I can't imagine how they feel if they were... Can't imagine how they'd feel if they were alive when it happened. Hopefully part of heaven is shielding them from the evil going on down here. So I put that in... Bear in mind, if you're new to this series and didn't catch how I started this, originally when I started creating this world that John lives in, I was listening to a lot of really extreme political ideas on both sides and thinking, well, it's a good thing. Originally I was like, good thing that these people are pretty much by themselves. Like, a lot of these really crazy ideas can't really be enacted because these people aren't in power and there's not enough people that agree with them to do these things. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. There have been some pretty crazy things that our government has done in the past. For example, the confiscation of gold happened. There was a time where the government felt that in order to fix things, it needed to actually confiscate people's wealth. There have been quote-unquote re-education camps, and they weren't really re-education camps, but we did have camps where we sent people of Japanese descent during World War II. Our government has done some pretty awful things in the past, and to assume that they never will do those things in the future is supremely naive, especially when people say, well, we're protected by laws and the Constitution and all these other things. Those awful things that our government has done, they did under the same laws and protections that we have. So to assume that it'll never happen is foolish. So I wanted, when I was reading those things that people were saying, I went from the logical, no, that'll never happen again, to, well, wait a minute, it has happened before. And then finally I went, well, what would happen if it happened again in the future? And that's where this story sort of springs from, is what would happen if the people that really believed we needed re-education camps, and what would happen if the people that believed we needed to take everybody's wealth, what would happen if all of those people actually enacted all of their different ideas, what would the world look like? And so I started creating that world, and then I said, well, how would people react to that? And that's where John and his friends come in, and the Republic of Texas. How would other Americans react to that all happening? So that scene or that excerpt with the confiscation of wealth, that has happened in the past. So we can't assume it won't happen in the future. And what would the world be like if we lived in a country, we do live in a country that's capable of that? What would happen if they did it again? So that's why that's there. It's there to show that it has happened before, and we can't assume these bad things will never happen again. They can. So we always have to be cognizant of that. The rain had been beating down on their heads for hours. The fat drops fell through the dry leaves of the trees, hitting the red and orange carpet of the forest floor, sounding like distant applause in a packed theater. The fat drops fell on the leaves of the trees, hitting the red and orange carpet of the forest floor. period. The sound was like distant applause in a packed theater. Benny looked around at the miserable people huddled under blankets, tarps, and jackets. Some were just sitting as close to the trees to a tree as possible, having no place else to shelter from the storm. Benny was irritated at the rain and at the people around him. He intended to keep going despite the weather, but when they stopped for a break, most of the people sat down and refused to get back up. He cursed his luck, getting stuck with people who were used to their comfortable homes in town. Several times he had considered just leaving them and going on by himself, but they were just passing thoughts. He wasn't a very religious man, but he believed in God. He knew God wouldn't look too well on him if he left these people to fend for themselves. The wet was going to be a problem, Benny knew. It would be a cold night, and if they couldn't find a way to dry their clothes, especially their socks, the trip was going to get a lot worse. Some people had dry clothes in their packs, but Benny noticed quite a few packs had soaked through. Plastic was an expensive commodity, being made from petroleum, and no one had any real waterproofing. He had scouted a small stream a few hundred yards south. Hold on. A field, not stream. He'd scouted a small field a few hundred yards south, and if the sun would break through soon, they might be able to dry things out before dark. He hoped modesty wasn't going to be an issue. Give them a break. They aren't like you. A woman had approached Benny without him noticing, only serving to irritate him further. She crouched down close, holding a blanket over her damp hair. What do you mean? Benny asked, honestly confused. You're sitting here brooding. You're sitting here brooding, looking at everyone like a father does a disobedient child. We're all doing our best, Benny, she said. He studied her face a moment. They don't trust me. Most of them are afraid of me. They don't know you, Benny. She shook her head. Most of us haven't been away from Stuart since we can remember. We've lost everything, and the feds the feds want to take more. Everyone is scared, and without John we feel lost. He looked down for a time, thinking on her words, and watching the raindrops striking the leaves at his feet. Finally he nodded to himself and turned back to her. You're Steve's wife, right? He asked. Sarah, she nodded. At the mention of her husband, he looked away, clearly trying to control whatever emotions were She looked away. Ugh. Wait a minute. Hold on. Sarah, she nodded. At the mention of her husband, she looked away, clearly trying to control whatever emotions were boiling in her. He could tell she was worried her husband and the others might not catch up to them. Benny gave her a few moments to collect her thoughts. Just give us a break, all right, Benny? She said finally. Whether you realize it or not, we're looking to you to get us through this. Let me make that a contraction. Good man, you're Steve, Benny said, as she stood up to walk away. They'll get back to us soon. I hope so, she nodded, smiling at his compliment. He watched her walk back to where her son was huddled down with some other children under one of the few tarps they had. Benny hoped so too. He wasn't used to being around so many people all at once, and he knew he wasn't a good leader. He preferred to be on his own, doing his own thing. He was determined to do his best, though. He owed it to John. Benny had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, even if it killed him. Changing scenes here. The van transporting John and the others drove through the pounding rain for nearly an hour before the driver said he had to stop to use a bathroom. John's mind worked furiously, trying to think of some way to get his family and friends out of their predicament. The driver pulled the van into a parking lot of a small-town gas station. John knew they would be in Peoria soon, but he couldn't think of any way to get them out of the van. The officer in the passenger seat kept looking back at them, and John did his best to seem as if he was still occupied by grief. He was, but the need to escape was growing more powerful by the minute. Without warning, the officer in the passenger seat opened the door forcibly and got out with a softly spoken curse. John lost sight of him until he appeared at the back window of the van. John could hear the keys scraping in the lock. They were all surprised when the officer opened the back doors and climbed in with them. Without looking at them, he started unlocking their cuffs. John watched him in complete confusion. Look, the officer began. I understand what you're doing. I was assigned this job, but I don't like it. I can't leave the country, though. My sister is out there somewhere, and I have to find her. He looked John in the eye, and the two shared a moment of understanding. Love of family would drive a man to do things that would ruin him. A man would jump into hell if there was some chance that he could save his family. John nodded and shook the man's hand after his own was free. Quickly now, he pulled John out of the van. The others started to get out, and he held up his hand. You're taking the van. Stay in there. John followed him around to the driver's seat and climbed in after the officer opened the door. The engine was still running, and John could see there was plenty of gas. He turned to the officer. You could come with us. We could help you find your sister, John said. I would if I could. I hate this place, but I can't take the chance of getting caught before I find her. We've already said his sister. We already know who he's looking for, so we're just going to say her. The officer said, Now, you're going to have to hit me pretty good. Otherwise, they won't believe you escaped on your own. John looked at the man in shock as the officer tossed his keys into the passenger seat. The young man seemed to prepare himself as John sat speechless. Come on, John, you don't have much time, the officer said. What's your name? John finally said. James, the officer replied, and turned his head slightly to give John a good target. Now get on with it before I chicken out. John steeled himself for the distasteful task of beating a man that had just helped him and his family. He knew the other officer would be out soon, and this was the chance he had been looking for. Come on, word. It was as if God had put James in his path to answer his prayers. John pulled back his fist and hit James squarely in the side of the head. There was a painful moment when John thought he had broken his hand, and the officer stood stunned. Time seemed to slow as James stumbled and searched and reached for his head. Hold on. Stood stunned. Okay, that doesn't work. His eyes rolled back and he dropped to the pavement. John could see that James had not been knocked unconscious, but he was clearly too disoriented to move much in his prone position. I hope you find your sister, John said quietly, as he closed the door and put the van in reverse. He backed the vehicle into the road and drove away, back in the direction they came from. He saw in the mirror, just as he pulled away, the driver exit the gas station. The officer looked from the van to his fallen partner in disbelief. John, Amanda said tentatively, what just happened? John looked back at the faces of his friends and family. They were all in a state of disbelief. His friend, there's only one friend there. He would never know why, but the scene caused him to start laughing. Maybe it was the pent-up grief or stress or some other emotion that he would never be able to explain. We don't need that there. Some other emotion he would never be able to explain. He laughed so hard he cried and his stomach hurt. The others in the back looked at each other, probably wondering if he had lost his sanity. Finally, he calmed down enough to answer her. A miracle, dear. We have been given a miracle. We've been given a miracle. All right. Pent up. Is that, yeah, hyphenated word. Good job catching that last time. All right, so we're going to mark chapter 21 as where we're at for next time. Come on, there we go, highlighted. Okay, thank you so much, Keiko, for joining me, and anybody else who did. I hope you had fun and enjoyed the story, and maybe this will help you write or edit or get motivated or just be an entertaining couple hours spent listening to my novel. I really appreciate it. If you guys can like, comment, share, get the video out there. A lot of people don't, YouTube is pretty bad about sharing small videos. Again, if you're watching this, check my Twitter feed. Every time after I'm done with the episode, I will share a link to this book so you can go read it when you want. You can read ahead or read as we go or whatever you like, bearing in mind that it is not edited, the online link. It's on a site that I posted couple years back, and so it will not carry any of the edits I've been doing during this show. But thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful night, and I will see you hopefully Saturday morning for Saturday Randomness, and again next week for this show, which may be on a different night because I have shooting on Thursdays next week. So I will see you then. You guys have a wonderful one, and much love.